I would like to introduce Eric Bruner. Eric is the Chief Technologist at GP Strategies. For those of you who may not have heard of GP Strategies, they are one of the world's leading performance improvement consulting firms. They also may be one of the world's leading firms in terms of consulting around learning strategies and learning technologies and deployments, and providing services to, I would guess, like the Global 2000, the Global 1000, those organizations that, you know, multinational and global perspective. Eric's going to talk to us about the curation conundrum, freedom or focus. Eric, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Super. Do we have a clicker? Anybody got a clicker? If not, if there is a clicker, I'll take one. Okay. But otherwise, we'll roll through this. So thank you. I think EdCast's invites me back to speak because I seem to be the guy to bring these great conversations from such a high level back to tactical and operational. So we'll do that. I also respect the fact that Josh and I are the last two between dinner and the rest of your life, so we'll kick right in. So freedom or focus, the curation conundrum. So the concept of curation, is anybody considering curation in your organization or at your customers, right? Curation, big buzzword out there. I think it's a little bit like sales enablement. There's probably a couple different definitions, so we'll tackle that. Let's jump right in. Next slide. All right, so some of you might recognize this immediately. This is the baseball field from the movie Field of Dreams. All right, for those of you who don't recognize it, there's a couple standing out there in center field. At this point in the movie, he is explaining to his wife that he's been hearing voices, and the voices are telling them, if you build it, they will come. And he's explaining he just cut down all of their cash-generating crops to build this field in hopes that people will come and pay to see it. And ever since this movie came out, it's a great movie by the way if you haven't seen it, ever since this movie came out, it kind of became the go-to analogy for any time our industry was putting together a social platform, a knowledge network, community practice, whatever you want to call it. I think it's a valid question. If they go to will they come? How does that work? I think we heard today, and I think we all recognize that the probability of success with these types of systems is so much greater than even 5 years ago. But I believe there's even a second question that unfortunately still exists out there. And this is the beginning of the conundrum. Next slide, please. All right, so if you build it and they come, what will they bring with them? What will they build, right? So even in 2017, there's still a fear in certain industries and a lot of the companies we work with. How is the conversation going to stay online? Is it really going to be aligned with our corporate strategies? All right, next slide, please. All right, and we kind of ask the question that says, well, if you don't allow that freedom, aren't we just going to end up with more and more corn, right? We heard from Kevin earlier today that you know, the cost of not innovating, the cost of not evolving is pretty heavy, right? So from that perspective, you know, freedom or focus and the concept of conundrum, when we talk about this, you know, I think you know, we believe that it's absolutely freedom and focus, and we're going to talk a little bit how to operationalize that element. Next slide, please. All right, so just let's get on with defining the concept of curation. Just go ahead and, I'd ask you to close your eyes, but I'm afraid I'll lose you all. So just go ahead and picture a museum. All right, everyone just picture a museum. And I don't care if you're thinking about your 7th grade school art exhibit or whether you've been to the Louvre. I bet you didn't picture this. Next slide. Ruth, there's still no clicker? I feel kind of lost up here, but I bet you none of you pictured this, right? A haphazard arrangement of art on top of crates with you know, things shoved in the corner. I bet you probably had an app, right? You probably definitely had a program. You may have had an audio assist helping you get through that exhibit, right? And the curator went through the purpose of actually helping you with the conversation and helping you with the experience to understand what the exhibit's all about, right? Next slide, please. And so that's why when we look at the concept of curation, we just don't worry about content. We focus on curation, on content, conversation, and experience, right? All three of those have to be curated together. All right, so that's our definition. Next slide, right? And I think we can blitz right through this one. I think we had a lot of great conversations about what the modern learner and the future learner is going to look like out there. So we'll just, thank you. Big green button. All right, so let's just skip over that. But I also think we heard a lot today that, you know what, that modern learning experience doesn't necessarily jive with how our brains work, right? I know we all want quick, fast, just in time, but we heard from Raul, and we definitely heard yesterday in the transcending thing, that you know, the concept of the brain needing to actually focus and spend time on what it is digesting is real, right? Charles talked a lot about, you know, the concept that, you know, conversation is the #1 true mechanism for learning in the workplace, right? And that we primarily learn over time through real work experiences, right? So how does that actually work with the concept of micro-learning, or just-in-time, if you will? And I think we all understand this conversation, so let's just move on. But given that, right, we had took the time to write out some of these myths about curation out there, right? And I'll let you read these. You know, so curation isn't just aggregating a whole bunch of content. We believe that there's a little planning and nurturing and love that needs to go along with that in terms of conversation and experience. But I'll just pose this question to you. Can any of you imagine taking on a curation project without something like EdCast's? You saw that demo today on how the aggregation in the machine can really get you a jump start. And if without that technology, how would you even have the time to curate the conversation and the experience? So on to our next analogy, right? So when we're talking with customers about this, and we're focusing on customers just getting started on this concept of transformation, and for these customers, the transformations are huge. They're up there with mergers and acquisitions and leadership development programs and moving into new markets and new product launches, right? The concept of a learning transformation around curation, you know, typically requires some attention. So we break it into 2 distinct parts. I know you're all flying home tonight or tomorrow, and aren't we blessed, right? A little play on words here, that our pilots have the freedom to focus on getting us from point A to point B comfortably, right? And guess what they're not worrying about? They're not worrying about anything that's going on in the airport, right? The logistics, the fuel, baggage, air traffic control. They don't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff, right? So we break it into 2 parts. The airport view, we kind of talk about the program view, right? And again, this is how you get your initiative aligned with corporate strategy, stakeholder management, those types of things. From the flight perspective, we call use case, right? And this is a term we've worked out with EdCast's as they've been helping their customers, and we've been a partner of theirs helping our customers. Is, you know, each flight has its own passenger list, has its own pilot, has its own destination, and as that flight starts to take shape, we call that a use case. All right, so here's the whole picture. And one thing I definitely want to suggest is that as we learned some of the principles of the design thinking is that we're not going to build an airport that can launch 1 million planes in a day, right? That just doesn't make any sense. We have to factor in, again, a little ideation, a little testing, a little test and learn. So we're growing and learning, and as we test and prove hypotheses, we'll scale and expand, right? So before dinner, we're going to go through each of these white boxes in detail. Actually, we're not. So I just throw this out there. I'm an acronym guy. You can see that, right? So SHAPE, right? And we talked the concept of the term maker yesterday. We would call that a shaper. So you'll see that here in a second. So we're just going to talk about the definition of this thing called a use case. I think that's really what has helped our customers figure out how to jump in and get started, and then how a use case can bend and flex that freedom and focus balance, if you will. All right, so again, freedom and focus, baked in, both, right? And next acronym, ACTS, right? So this is how we do it, right? So what's the audience? What's the content, right? What's the time frame to prove the hypotheses, right? And success criteria. We think across 3 different dimensions. Again, these 3 dimensions come from the human-centered design concepts of business, experience, and technology, right? And we have this model of day 1. So even Patricia from Shire, who seemed to launch a whole bunch of content quickly without a lot of this kind of information, if she, in a month or 2, realizes that, you know, a particular audience isn't paying attention, this is a way she can go out and look at that audience. Who is it, right? By name, what size, what scope, what's the minimum viable set of content that they need to affect a conversation that they need to have, right? And we'll talk about a couple different types of use cases that are out there. The next thing is this maker, right? We call them the shaper. This is your pilot, right? And you can see I've conveniently left the picture blank here and put your picture here. And I just want to impact upon you that if you don't get somebody in this role, it's going to end up being you, which may not be the right answer, right? So this is a real scenario, and that shaper needs a crew, and we call them voices. I think most of us in this room would have called them SMEs, right? But I've been talking a lot to a gentleman named Mike Pino. Ann from GE mentioned him earlier today. He's been doing this for a long time at GE, the transformation to digital. And he's absolutely convinced me the right word is voices, because yes, you have to have expertise, but if you don't have humor, you don't have empathy, you don't have proactive, you don't have connectors, right, then you don't have a community that's going to grow. So the concept of voices out here. So this becomes the definition of the use case. Which audience? What content, what time frame are you going to try to prove out some of your hypotheses, and what are those hypotheses? Right? And so what we thought we would do is internally at GP Strategies, we're turning on EdCast's, right? And we started with a couple use cases, and we just thought we'd describe them to you to help you understand this concept of the use case. Our first is our business development, sales, and account manager team, right? They were probably should have been sitting here listening to this last conversation. We actually have content from Scott published in our system out there. So again, just real quick, they went through that shape process, and we asked them to build what we call a use case canvas, where they lay out a bunch of these things. This particular shaper, right, was the vice president of customer experience. He had a personal mandate for this 25% metric, and he's putting it right into his use case, his decision, right? And then one thing that we focused on, again, back on that concept of the user-centered design, or human-centered design, is if you think back to Mike's presentation yesterday on the tool set from Stanford, one of them was called future telling. We call that sound bites, right? So what is it 90, 180 days from now, if you were stalking the chat rooms or walking through the halls and you were listening to people talk about your use case, what is it you'd like to hear? And again, we asked them to think about that to make sure they're bringing back what they actually intend from a user experience perspective. So that use case we classify as a convergence type of use case. The reason we picked this audience is that we had, through acquisition and reorganization, a diverse set of skills and knowledge about what it is we actually sell to our customers and how we help customers, right? So this VP of Customer Experience has a business challenge to get them all to a level playing ground, right? I do hope and fully expect that the conversation will shift into a divergent one where we need to push those boundaries, but right now we're converging to a single ideational scaffolding that we can build from as we move into the future. Well, let's contrast that with a divergent case, right? So our second use case that we want to talk about is our managers inside our organizations, right? We got this group as our managers and managers of managers. We're quite proud of this group. They're great people. They have a common model. They have experiences, right? But yet we've gotten some feedback, and we use our own engagement process internally, and the thing that we coalesced out of our feedback was this concept of grow. So that's the word we kind of built on. So the shaper for this use case, right? Grow your team, grow yourself, grow the business, and grow in every sense of the word. You can read some of the sound bites that they had out there. So this scenario is a divergent one, right? Again, they have the skills and knowledge, a common model, but we need to push new boundaries. So here you'll see a lot more open-ended type scenarios, as opposed to what we heard up here from the sales forum with our first use case, maybe some more product knowledge type activities, right? So each of these use cases have a freedom or focus. This one, again, divergent. We're actually asking these managers to get outside of themselves, get outside the box, and actually buck the system, look at what we're doing now, and find a way to shift it. On our first use case, we're going to encourage thought and innovation, and we're ready to grab anything that comes out of that, because when you put people together and get that innovation going, you got to look for the opportunities. But we're also looking to and measuring to make sure we get that performance norming across that group. And the last thing I'll just leave with you is, you know, we did the 8 pedals yesterday, I got 4 pedals here, kind of in that same light, is that we actually challenge our shapers to look through as they're designing the experience and the content set, right? You got to be able to handle the pace of business, right? So this is what we call the moment of need, right? Guided, I bet you're all thinking, oh, structured learning. Oh, well, that's up to you. I don't do that. It's whatever you think needs to be guided. We've heard a lot of folks up here says, how do you train 88,000 people, right? Well, you got to get them from point A to point B, whether that's a whole bunch of informal learning with a good path that EdCast's can enable for you, right? We talked about self-select. I'm just going to scratch that out and put edX there, right? Just joking, but literally I'm bringing that back to our HR organization. And then lastly, insights, right? And this is the total, what I think, where all these epiphanies and their freedom occur. When you get this people together, right, and you gather insights, right, you have to have your shapers and your program view have to be able to see those, nurture those, and take those and move them into the evolution of your business. So anyhow, I know it's late. That's all I got. Thank you much.